Hello and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. This is episode 123. To think about how to introduce today's episode, I went into the statistics function of the website that hosts this platform, like where I post them, to get some data on where all of you are located. And no surprise, about 65% of you are located in English-speaking countries, the US, UK, Canada, Australia, and so forth. The rest are mostly from European countries, and I'm going to note, just out of interest, that there are 5 times more listeners in Turkey than there are in Russia. So as we talk about Europe in today's episode, this topic will have more resonance for some of you than for others. Most English-speaking countries are either not in the sort of vague constellation of what we call Europe or the European Union. And if you grow up in the European Union, as I did, or in the predecessor formations of what is now the European Union, that question, like what is Europe, has a particular significance that has to do with political choices being made in the present, like which countries to include, which countries are not to, and so forth. These are ongoing debates. So when I was growing up in one of these little corners of Europe, in Greece, the questions of the West and of Europe were configured quite differently. The West was more of a relational question. I remember this is in the 70s and 80s. It had to do with the relation between centers of power in Europe and North America versus the rest of the world, which at the time when I was a child was still being called the Third World, and it was a relational question of this part of the world and its relations with that part of the world. And the fuzzy areas in between weren't all that important in that big structure of the debate. The question of Europe, on the other hand, was precisely about those fuzzy areas in between. Where does Europe end? What is Europe? What is the template or matrix that makes a country European or not? And I remember when I was a child, my father actually was explaining to me what at the time was the European Economic Community that Greece was a member of, not from the first batch of countries that joined, but I think the second or whatever, pretty early on. Like, why would these big players like, France and Germany and, so forth want little old Greece with, at the time, very small economic production to be part of the group? And he said, well, it just didn't make any sense to have a Europe without Greece, being how important the classical Greek civilization was for European identity. But he said it's not entirely clear that they want us, but the point is that Greece is such a small part of the whole economic picture. At the time it must have been, 1% or something like that, that it's an affordable get. However, there was always this looming question in Greece as to whether we really are Europeans, and are we first-class members of the club? Are there second-class members? Are we that? Are we kind of like one foot in each world? And what's the other world? And so forth. And the same questions were obviously playing out in the sort of centers of political and economic power of what became the European Union, as to which countries do we want to admit. And there were all kinds of both economic and cultural and religious factors that played into this debate. Now, it may seem obvious, perhaps, to many of you that Greece is a part of Europe, but it is not at all obvious to many theorists from Western Europe who write about the question of what is Europe. I routinely come across statements in leading theorists of European civilization, which implicitly, though very rarely explicitly, make it clear that sort of Eastern Europe, or large parts of Eastern Europe, but certainly Greece, are not part of Europe. Specifically, definitions that go along the following lines, that the area that we call Europe today roughly corresponds to 11th century Latin Christendom. I'm quoting from Olivier Roy's book, Is Europe Christian? English translation came out 4 years ago. And there are many other theorists who make that kind of identification. So where Latin was the official or formal language or the church in the 11th century, more or less, say 12th, that's where Europe really is today. Now, of course, the interesting thing is that in the 11th century, those places of Latin Christendom did not think primarily that they constituted an entity known as Europe. Obviously, the geographical term existed, and it had some sort of cultural identity valence, but very, very little. It was really not until the 15th century that Europe became the dominant group term or group identifying label for the cluster of cultures that made Europe something more than a geographical label, but a kind of club of cultures that had affinities, be they political, linguistic, religious, or however you define it. So what happened in the 15th century that caused the switch, that is from Latin Christendom to Europe? Well, lots of things happened in the 15th century, but we happen to have a major figure of the Italian Renaissance, Aeneas Piccolomini, who later became Pope Pius II. And before he became Pope, he wrote a treatise called Europa, Europe, which was precisely an attempt to define the kind of parameters and history and peoples of Europe. And while he certainly isn't the inventor of this trend, he's probably expressing it, but he gave it a real push and combined it with his sort of classical antiquarian humanistic interests, plus the fact that he was a very high-ranking clergyman in the Catholic Church, eventually cardinal and then pope. So he combined all of these identities and interests of his into this bundled package that he called Europe and gave it an emotive force. This is the subject of a fascinating new monograph by Nancy Bisaha, who is a professor of history at Vassar College. Her book, which is a reading of Aeneas's life, but also his understanding of Europe, is called From Christians to Europeans, Pope Pius II and the Concept of the Modern Western Identity. And she explores all of the sort of nuances and byways of this concept of Europe as it's emerging in Aeneas's thought in the 15th century. And one of the very interesting things about it is that he was very much invested in the fate of Constantinople. And the fall of Constantinople to the Turks in 1453 seems to have been one of the catalysts that pushed him in kind of reaction to Ottoman expansion to formulate this idea of Europe and to try to define, who's in it and who's not, and not just in the present, but also the past, whose past is included in the genealogy of Europe. And Nancy's ideally situated to write such a book. Her earlier book was called Between East and West, and it was a study of Italian humanists' view of the Ottoman Turks. So this interaction between Western Latin and Ottoman Turkish civilizations at this time seems to have been the kind of very creative matrix in which the idea of Europe was born, at least for Aeneas. And the fall of Constantinople is a turning point, is a kind of fulcrum for that development. These are both excellent, very readable and accessible books too, thoroughly grounded in the sources. I recommend that you read them if you're interested in these questions. For our part, they highlight how important the history of the Eastern Empire, Eastern Roman Empire, was to conceptions of Western Europe and Europe. I think throughout the Middle Ages, we talk about this in the episode, the West in the Middle Ages is defined in relation to the East. The East is the Eastern Empire. And even when Europe emerges, it's a kind of, in part, an attempt to compensate for the loss of the East. Anyway, enough from me. Let's hear it directly from Nancy. Again, thanks to medievalist.net for reposting these episodes. Let's get right to the discussion. Nancy, welcome to the podcast.
Hi, great to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me.
So you have written or had written one of, I think, the most cited books in 15th century studies. So this was your earlier book, which is Creating East and West, Renaissance Humanists and the Ottoman Turks, which comes up every time I venture into the 15th century, in part because it deals with so many different sort of intersection of so many different peoples and interests and empires and traditions of scholarship. Italian humanists, obviously, but Ottoman Turks, and squeezed between them, the Greeks, or however you want to call them, right? So it tends to come up in a number of different fields. So it's great. I used it a lot when I worked on Baonikos, and now I was back in the 15th century for work on the Siege of Constantinople. Anyway, so you kept coming up again. And I came across your most recent book, which we'll be talking about today, From Christians to Europeans, Pope Pius II and the Concept of the Modern Western Identity. And this focuses on one figure primarily. So this is Aeneas Silvius Piccolomini, who became Pope Pius II. There's a lot of sort of richness in the book and close readings, and we won't be able, obviously, to go into all of the detail here, and I encourage the audience to go read it for more. Can you start out by telling us, sort of in broad terms, who Aeneas Piccolomini / Pius II was?
Yeah, so sure. So Aeneas had a very interesting storied life. There are a number of chapters to it, and he starts off life as the son of two exiled nobles from outside of Siena, and they were impoverished. He somehow managed to get a good education from the local parish priest and found his way toward the humanities, the classics. So he is what we would call a humanist. I try to explain it to my students as somebody who is kind of like a Greek and Roman studies major today, except the
Yeah.
expectation is that with a degree like that, you really go places in the world where, it's, I think everybody who does a degree like that should obviously go into government. All these doors should be open to them in the same way that they were for somebody in the 14th and 15th century and 16th century. But yeah, it was considered training for not just to become a teacher or a scholar, but something that one could apply in politics, in diplomacy, in advising powerful people, and being a leader oneself. So that's the path that he ended up following and embracing. He went to the Studio of Siena, or the University of Siena. He ended up working as a secretary for many years. He was the secretary at the Council of Basel in Switzerland and did some traveling during that time. He then went on to serve the Holy Roman Emperor Frederick III. So he spent a lot of time in Austria and in Germany. And during those 2 decades, he really got to travel around. He went to a number of countries, even went as far as Scotland, which was pretty unusual at the time. He went to Bohemia. He went all over Germany and Austria, France, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and several different areas of Italy. So he acquired a lot of knowledge about different areas in ways that I think many of his contemporaries wouldn't have, that he was exposed directly to many of these places. He entered the clergy later in life. He became a priest in his 40s. And then once he entered the clergy, he was pretty rapidly promoted. He became Bishop of Trieste first, and then Siena, and a cardinal in 1456, and then was elected Pope in 1458. So that's a little bit about him.
Right. And he got to know, as you said, a lot of Europe, of which he sort of wrote a book later. We'll be talking about that. So he kind of knew a lot about what he was writing later on. But so when you say classical education, this is Latin, right? Not Greek, right? Is there any indication
Yeah,
of how much Greek he had?
good question. He definitely he was a Latinist. He learned a little Greek. I think he knew his way around some Greek, but he was not really an accomplished scholar of Greek. So I think most of what he knew of Greek was coming through translations, or kind of coming by way of other scholars.
Right. At the time when he was educated, Greek was not widely available in Italy or kind of expected for a humanist. It would be later on, but not
Yeah,
this is the
yeah.
cusp.
Exactly. He's
right?
right on. He is right on the cusp. Yeah. Had he been a
Mm,
few decades later, definitely, I think it would have been fully expected. And who knows,
yeah,
too? Maybe part of it was because of his economic circumstances. Had
sure.
he grown up a little more privileged, he might have been able to have tutors, who could have exposed him to that earlier.
So, what are his major preoccupations in the 1450s? So, this is when he wrote the book Europe. So, what's he thinking about at that time?
What is he thinking about? This is obviously something we're going to unpack quite a bit. So I'll just give you the brief answer. But the short version of it is in the 1450s. He is at first the decade kind of opens with him thinking about a way to get out of Germany and Austria. He was hoping to get back to Italy. I think he really wanted to be at the Papal Curia. He wanted to have an important role there. And then the major event that happens is the fall of Constantinople in 1453. And as I argue in the book, and I've argued, I guess, in a number of things I've published, books and articles, it really changes him. It can only be understood as a traumatic event for him. The reports that he received affect the way that he sees not only Greece, that he sees, the Ottoman Turks, but the way that he starts thinking about Europe and thinking about his place in it, thinking about the relationship that other Europeans have to one another, and this sense that they constituted this cultural and political entity that he was trying to promote and defend. So in the 1450s, that weighs very heavily on him, especially after 1453.
Right. So, can you give us some sense of his reaction to the fall of Constantinople? Because he describes it in sort of very powerful emotional terms in some of his texts. And do you have a sense of why this might have impacted him so, powerfully, seeing as the East was not one of the areas where he had traveled?
Mm-hmm.
And you argue that this is a kind of catalyst for him in thinking about Europe as a kind of cultural entity, despite all of its political differences. Why Constantinople, though? I mean, this is the interesting question that I found.
Mm. It is a very interesting question. And I would say my theory is one of the reasons he reacts as strongly to it. There are probably two main reasons that he reacts so strongly to it. One is the scale of it, that and the tenor of the reports that come back. This notion that it was a city that had a population of about 50,000, most of which were civilians, and that the city was completely taken over. And I'll be very curious to see what your research turns up. By the way, just inject in here for a second. I'm a big fan of your work. So,
Oh, thank you.
when you mentioned that you are studying the fall of Constantinople and planning
Yeah.
to write about it, I'm really excited to see what you have to say, because I've tried to make my way through some of these reports myself and get a sense of what do we know about the sack? What do we know about, these, because you hear some competing
Yeah.
stories about it. And I can certainly say what he was hearing, right? Whether or not it was reliable. He heard at first stories that everyone had been killed over the age of 6, right? Which is kind of astonishing to imagine. And then corrections come back and they say, no, it wasn't quite that severe at all. But nonetheless, I think estimates about 10,000 people were killed. Many people put into slavery, captivity. So I think that was one of the things that he responds to, was the notion of this city of civilians suffering so badly, and many people being executed from the Venetian nobility and the Byzantine nobility and leadership, that was traumatizing for him. The thought of churches being converted was very upsetting. He, in his earliest letters, talks about Hagia Sophia and other churches. But so that's one part of it, and I'm bleeding into the second part now, which is the cultural part. I think another reason he responds so strongly is there were reports that countless books were lost. I think there was one report that's circulating from Isidore of Kiev, comes by way of him, that he estimated some 120,000 books were lost. And which, fascinating number. I don't know where he must have had some idea of some libraries or something like that to make that estimate. But that too, I think, really was deeply upsetting for Aeneas, because as a humanist and as somebody who's part of this group of scholars who are eagerly trying to recover as many ancient texts as possible, I think he just couldn't fathom how something like that could happen, how anybody would want to destroy books and libraries. So in his early letters, he also makes a lot of assumptions about the Ottomans as being anti-learning, right? That they were, he evokes notions of a new barbarian. So
Right.
those are I think the two main reasons. But there's probably another in that as he starts to reflect on the geography and he starts to think about the position of Constantinople. This is something we could talk more about, but I think he had this sense that Constantinople could have been the savior of Europe, that had it held, that it was still a very important bulwark. He's certainly not the only person to have said that and used those terms. So that too might have played into it as well, that somehow this potential defense was lost and that it was
Mhm.
devastating.
Well, we should probably have a separate discussion on the fall of Constantinople. The stories that he was told initially are way off
Yeah.
in a number of ways. I mean, I can just hint at a little bit of what I have found. So actually, few people killed, far fewer
Mhm.
than the number you said. The Turks were primarily interested in enslaving,
Right. Mhm.
but far, far more enslaved and captured. In fact, everybody.
Mm.
And this is what's not uh, understood about the fall of Constantinople. I went through all of the books, and the sources are absolutely clear about this. But the modern scholarship just doesn't actually bring it to the point where you can see it, which
Hmm.
is that the city was emptied out
Really?
entirely.
Wow.
And for days, it was empty. There was nobody there. It ceased to exist.
Hmm.
The Ottoman army did not move in. They didn't occupy the place. They left. They dispersed with their captives.
Mhm.
And it was very slowly that people began to return, and the Sultan found ways, lots of different ways of trying to get people to go back. Um, and the stories of captivity and ransoming, and so these went on for years, some of them, and we
Yeah.
have so much evidence for it, and it hasn't really been studied systematically. So it's quite a story from that point of view. Um, but I would also add that I think Constantinople was very important in the kind of symbolic, sort of the geographical imaginary, even of Western Europeans,
Mhm.
as a city founded by Constantine the Great, as a
Yeah.
city that had always been Christian and a kind
Hmm.
of, you know, capital of the Roman Empire at some point, whatever they might have thought about the Greeks. This was just something that had existed long before any of the societies of Western Europe.
Yeah.
And suddenly it's just gone. And I think it drove the point home that something is changing dramatically, over there, and it might come over here.
Mm.
So, when these kinds of certainties collapse, what's next?
Yeah, no, I think that that's absolutely right. That is something he evokes as well. Is I think that a lot of Latins just took for granted that Constantinople was just going to keep going on, and despite all of the warnings, all the pleas for
Mm,
help coming from the Eastern Empire, they just really drag their feet in ways that
yeah.
make you scratch your head as you're reading it and thinking, why is the Pope playing this game right now? Why isn't he just sending a fleet of ships immediately? Why are the Venetians holding out, right? That
Yeah.
sort of thing. So
Yeah.
yeah, but I think that's also very much a part of it. But yeah, I wanted to just follow up very quickly, if I could, with a question for you. So I definitely I take your point about the captivity, the enslavement and such, right? So we know what Dukas has to say about having interviewed some of the soldiers later, and the sense that he got that it wasn't really their goal to to kill citizens so
Yeah.
much as to capitalize on enslavement and ransoms and such. Do you have any opinion on Runciman's argument that cities, whole areas of the city were spared, or kind of given Mehmet's protection? Because that's something I've tried to look at, and I'm not sure where he's getting that from. But
No, I have not come across anything like that in the sources. Unless by the city we mean, Calatas or Pera, which is the Genoese
yeah.
colony. That's essentially a different state entity. It had a totally different relationship to the siege and to the Ottomans. No, so the problem is that Runciman, and this is amazing, that Runciman is still our most recent narrative reconstruction.
Right.
And so 1965, and part of the problem is that Runciman was relying on a 16th century forgery.
Oh, okay.
Right? That it's not really until 20 years ago or so that it just became clear that we should not be using this source. It's a 16th century Greek reworking of the sort of memoirs or notes of Georgios Franzis. And it was done by a very accomplished forger
Right. Right.
who knew how not to overdo it and sort of, kind of generate suspicion. And so because what he says is often plausible, modern historians were like, oh, this sounds plausible. Yeah, he's also a very good, forgery has to do with the authorship, but he's an inventor. He's a novelist. And so, anyway, no, what happened was so the Sultan is allowed to take about something like a quarter of the spoils, as it were. And so the entire population was removed from the city into two places, the ships in the harbor and the camp of the Ottomans outside the walls. So he went to the camp and he selected his fourth. This is a few days afterwards. And he then relocated them inside the city, assigning them to different neighborhoods. Right? Just imagine that experience, right? Like you're living in the city and it falls and you're enslaved and taken out to the camps. You spend a few nights in these slave pens and then you're relocated to a different part of your own city to live. It's just weird.
Yeah, that is just hard to fathom.
Yeah. So he settled them along the harbor and then he tries to bring more people in. But it took him years to even figure out what to do with Constantinople.
Yeah. He didn't make it his capital immediately. It took a little time.
No. So no, I haven't found any part of the city that was spared.
Okay. All right.
There are also some various mistranslations of some of the sources and things like that kind of generate these statements that are recycled from one historian to the next. But no, it's but the project of ransoming a lot of the Westerners, especially Venetians, it sort of preoccupied Venice for a few years and its banks. The banks were involved. This is another fascinating story because so they had a fiduciary duty to pay interest on the accounts to heirs, but to do that they had to find the heirs.
Yeah.
So the Venetian Senate authorized the banks to use the accounts to track down heirs and either ransom them, or if they happen to be freed by then, to pay them the account. Anyway, it's a banking story.
Yeah. Well, that's a good source of information.
Yes. There's also a question of like, who gets to be ransomed? And there were a number of Italian students in Constantinople. One of them wrote an epic Virgilian poem about the fall, Posculo.
Yes.
And Aeneas could very well have known people who had studied there. Anyway, I mean, there are closer connections. If you, the 15th century, have you ever played with yourself the like a Kevin Bacon 6 Degrees of Separation game?
Yeah. I start thinking about these people and how they know each other. And
yes. Like, how would Aeneas have known, Isidore? When would they have met? You can nail it down to within 2 or 3 moves. I mean,
yeah.
Anyway, all right. So let's go back to Aeneas and his thinking about these events. So what did he think of, quote, the Greeks? I mean, obviously he had a sort of ambivalent view. Could you kind of outline it for us? Like, is there a split in his mind between ancient and modern Greeks? Is religion a factor?
Yes, definitely. I think so. I think that he had a more romantic view of the Greeks earlier on, where he didn't think quite so much about the religious differences, the schism, cultural differences, and even shortly after the fall of Constantinople, he seems very sympathetic to the Greeks. He laments the loss of the city. He laments the cultural losses. He laments their loss of power. And but then within a few years, you start to see him talking more about the schism, talking more about them bearing some sense of blame in the loss of the city, some uncharitable things about Constantine
Mm.
the 11th and others. And but I think in his works, you definitely from that point on, that as he starts to think more about things like identity, history, and in his Europa and some of his orations, and another work that he writes, the Asia, during his papacy, that it seems like there's a dividing line for him between the ancient Greeks and the modern Greeks. And he has very little interest or curiosity about the Byzantine period, which I find fascinating, but I don't think he's alone in that. I think that a lot of
Mhm.
humanists were, for whatever reason, conditioned to think that way. It goes back to Petrarch. Petrarch too, maybe because he was also skeptical about the Middle Ages, right? He helps give us the name
Right,
the Middle
right.
Ages. I think a lot of humanists were dismissive of what the Eastern Romans were doing during this period, right? That they, were incredible builders and scholars and leaders, and they don't get a lot of attention for Aeneas. So, yeah, I think a lot of times when he thinks about Greece, he's got this imaginative sense of ancient Greece, right? So, if you're reading his Europe, you kind of see him moving through different parts of it and talking mostly about either ancient losses, or victories, or modern ones,
Mm.
and very very little about what happened in between. And he does the same thing in Asia. As he kind of marches the reader around Asia, it's almost entirely about the ancient Greeks and mostly Romans, and mentions a little bit again about the Turks. But so I think he does not see them holistically in any sense.
Right. In part, this is due to the sources that he had. I mean, just in part. I don't want to suggest that there isn't some sort of ideological move or even blockage there, but
Mhm.
he had all of, ancient sources that are talking about ancient Greece and ancient Rome and Asia and so forth. And he had sources about what was going on now or very, very recently, but like, how's he supposed to know what's been going on in Constantinople for the past 1,000 years? I mean, that would require access to Greek sources or little hints that are scattered here and there in medieval Western sources, and he wasn't like interested in doing that kind of research. So I can imagine that there would be a kind of gap in his knowledge, but
Mhm.
there's also a kind of ideological elision here. I mean, like, I think it was hard for Western Europeans after a certain point to understand what the Eastern Empire was and
Mhm.
sort of make sense of it.
Yeah.
And he does talk about it in a kind of almost a sort of abstract way. I mean, you bring attention to some of these passages, but just to the Eastern Empire, and it's like,
Mhm.
what about it? Like, what was its culture? What was its people? What were they thinking? And
Yeah.
no, no. And what his main project as a pope, right, is to organize this crusade.
Mhm.
To do what exactly?
That's a great question. So we know that he had, Thomas Palaiologos came to Rome, right? He hosted him. He tried to arrange this marriage between Zoe and Ivan, and that ended up going south when she reverted from the Roman Catholicism back to Eastern Orthodoxy. But I don't know if I see it spelled out very much in his writings. What it would have looked like if they had managed, for instance, to get all the way to Constantinople and to reconquer it. Would they have put the Palaiologos family back on the throne? Would they have had any interest in that? Would they have tried to do something like akin to 1204, right? Create another Latin
Mm.
empire there, and under Roman Catholic rule. So I think what he was focused on, probably more than anything, he really wanted to send aid to Hungary because he thought that the Hungarians
Mm.
were fighting a winnable war, and that they knew how to fight against the Ottomans, and they'd had some really important successes. So in a lot of his works and orations and such, he's not as pie in the sky as you might think. He's fairly down to earth, that this is what should be done, right? But then when he's attempting to go on crusade at the end of his life, I don't know what, where the target even was, right? They're presumably all going to sail across the Adriatic together. I even wonder if he intended to go, or if he just wanted to show up at the port and bless everyone and help gather them. But I've just finished another article on this, and just thinking about it, did he entertain any ideas of possibly getting there and maybe even having a sit down with Mehmed II? Would that have crossed his mind? Because I think Mehmed was a figure of fascination for him,
Mm.
both horror and fascination. But so yeah, I don't quite know the shape that it would take. That I think that he a lot of times saw trying to fight the Ottomans in a piecemeal fashion, right? Sending aid to Skanderbeg, for instance, sending aid to other smaller entities. But I don't, I mean, I guess there's the idea that the Byzantine emperors were uniates, right? Or were supposed to be uniates. So maybe he would have
Sure.
tried to push that through in some way.
Yes, it's like the dog that caught the car. Like, what do you do with it now, right?
Right, right.
I've often fantasized about like, well, what kind of scenarios would play out there? Do you just occupy the city, sort of turn it into a bunker, use
Mhm.
it to disrupt Ottoman activities, or do you try to clear the Balkans and install what kind of regimes? It's just
Yeah,
so, yeah, anyway, it's bizarre. But
it is. It is.
yeah, and they don't tell us. Like they seem to be, well, we'll go and see how it works out.
Right, right.
Yeah. Anyway, all right. So tell us now about this work, the Europa. It's a text. So how is it organized? What's it trying to do? And let me know that you've collaborated in a translation of it that was published a few years ago.
Yes.
So that is accessible for the audience if you want to go read it. This is one of the first works to be written. It's kind of programmatically describing what Europe is. So what does this work do?
So this is a work that Pius wrote in what seems like a pretty brief period of time. He describes himself writing it while he's laid up with the gout, with the most renaissance of illnesses, it seems. And so he was, had one of these moments of convalescence during Lent in 1458, and he composes this. I think a lot of it's based on memory, but also a lot of writings. He's clearly borrowing from other writers that he doesn't acknowledge. So, we're still, I think, finding little pieces and saying, oh, that's where he got that from. But it is kind of a combination of like geography, choreography, and history. I'd say it's primarily history, and he describes it as such. And he doesn't use the word Europe very, very often, but he does describe, in the opening, that it's a history of, I think, the peoples of Europe, and areas, and he uses the term European, right, which is really important because that, as I've argued, is a term that you don't see before this point. I think that it's possible that one other writer before him got there first, one other Latin writer, but it's not widely known or used. So um, so I say he sees it as an effort to describe the continent, and especially to describe fairly recent history. He's looking at the last few decades. He loosely bases it around the reign of Emperor Frederick III. And
Mm.
so he talks about, history primarily from about 1440 onward, but he goes back in time. Goes a few decades earlier. Sometimes he goes back to the ancient period, the medieval period here or there. And it starts in Eastern Europe and kind of just creates this big circle, and ends up kind of going westward and then up north and comes around again. And he ends in Italy. Spends a lot of time in Italy, to the point
Mm.
where scholars like Casella have wondered if that was almost intended to be a separate piece because it has a different feel to it at times. So he spends less time talking about the geography there than he does in other areas. So I think he was influenced by Strabo in some ways, for sure, and influenced by Ptolemy and others.
Right. Well, these are imperial authors who would have centered Italy because of the Roman Empire
Mhm.
at the time. Um, so Europe had been used, yeah, as a geographical term in the past. It's probably not impossible that there's some references to Europeans, but I don't think that a mere reference to such a thing is the key point here. It's that
Mhm.
he's kind of attributing an identity to it, right?
Yeah.
It's like we Europeans, yeah, we have certain qualities. and that despite the sort of vast linguistic diversity of Europe and political fragmentation, he's trying to see it as a sort of coherent sort of cultural unit of some
Yes.
kind.
Yes.
Let's talk a little bit about its boundaries. So especially in the East, um, are the Turks in or out? And what about the Christian Greeks who are ruled by the Turks?
Good question. So in the Europa, the Turks are kind of they're both in and out in the sense that I think he often says the Turks are not European. They don't belong in Europe. He uses this phrase in many of his writings that they need to be pushed out of Europe.
Mm.
And but at the same time, as you're reading the Europa, they're everywhere, right? Especially in Eastern Europe, right? They are
Mm.
part and parcel of the political landscape. And he describes them, I think, in ways that are surprisingly dispassionate at times. He describes their diplomatic moves, their alliances, and how canny they are, right? How good they are at playing the game of taking advantage of some of the division that they find, and then using it to help further their own interests. So, I think he would answer by saying, no, they're not part of Europe, and yet they're
Yes.
there, which is, something I've argued, I think is interesting because the reader could take either message away, right? The reader could kind of focus on the oratorical piece of it that they are other, or they could say, but, I'm learning a lot about them, and they seem to be pretty well entrenched and operating by very similar rules and and are indispensable in a way to the engagements that are going on, right? You can't get around them. So as far as Eastern Christians go, he in Europe, he definitely sees Greece as part of Europe. There's no question in his mind the Balkans are part of Europe. So even though he points at times to schismatic beliefs or semi-heretical beliefs, and he does the same thing with the Bohemians, right? He talks about the Hussites and such.
Mm.
It doesn't exclude them from being part of Europe or Christendom, that he still sees them as belonging there. He certainly includes people more in the northern part of Europe. So he talks about Lithuania, he talks about Ukraine or Ruthenia, he talks about these regions in the east. He talks about Prussia and so forth, and Poland, but he doesn't say a word about Russia. Russia merits no mention whatsoever. So for him, that's not considered part of it at all.
Right. Well, Europe is so notoriously difficult to define because despite what we were told in school, it's like obviously not a continent, right? It's some kind of political designation or cultural or whatever. And so, of course, it's going to be all fluid. And, Russia and Turkey have always been like these liminal cases that where dissonance rules. Like, yeah, they are, but they're not, or they shouldn't be, but I'm going to treat them as if they are because, they are, but I don't like it.
Right,
Yeah,
right.
no, it's really
The
strange.
ambivalence is profound. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So apart from those liminal cases, what are the kinds of characteristics that he thinks are sort of distinctive to the Europeans? Like what kind of qualities does a people have to be an ideal type kind of European?
That's a great question. I would say for him, some of the bigger ones, definitely religion. That he Christianity is a very big and important part of it, and one that I've argued ends up getting subsumed, becomes almost part of the unconscious, where even as we get into the modern era and people throw off ideas of the church, there's still kind of this embedded notion of a Christian past that is hard to separate from Europe. And I think he helps join those at this moment, right? That it's there from the beginning for him. But it's also about culture. And there are different types of culture, right? There's high culture, there's low culture. There are these areas that are a little more rugged and have just converted to Christianity. And, so he, for instance, likes to talk about the Lithuanians and their penchant for bears. So he tells these funny little stories that people sort of wonder about, where's he getting this from? But these colorful stories about the fringes, right? Colorful stories about Scotland on the other end and so forth. And so he, I think in some ways, creates this notion of some areas being a little bit less civilized, quote unquote, than others, being a little less formally trained in, the liberal arts and the humanities and so forth. But they are still part of the whole in their own way. And of course, the center, right, would be areas where you have these wonderful cities. He describes, and he does this also in another work called the Germania, where he talks about, just how beautiful and pristine the cities of Germany are. And I think they really impress him compared to cities in Italy, where a lot of them, do have a lot of ancient buildings and monuments and such, whereas Germany has this kind of brand spanking new feel to it, right? And is, very well organized and built. And clean, I guess, is composed as compared to some areas that he's seen. So, but yeah, so urbanism is part of it, but definitely this sense of kind of culture. He uses that to juxtapose Europeans to the Turks quite a lot, right? To say that we understand the value of learning. We embrace the liberal arts here. They do not. So that becomes part of the myth of Europe. This idea that somehow that their culture is a notch above, if not several notches above other parts of the world. And he starts creating this kind of false dichotomy between Europe and Asia in that regard.
Right. And those qualities would imply, right, that Italy at that time is kind of the heart, the beating cultural heart of Europe, which is probably a position that he would, endorse. Which is interesting to me because I see sort of Europe as a concept. It sort of oscillates between North and South. And this is one of those rare moments when the South can, at least for a while, legitimately present itself as the cutting edge of Europe before it reverts to what we call Southern Europe, which is not the beating edge.
Right.
And the North takes over, like, in terms of empire and money and later industrialization and so forth. But this is this interesting moment when Southern Europe is, leading the charge.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
He gives Italy center stage. There's no question that he ends. I think it's about a quarter of the work is just focusing on Italy.
Right. There's something else that occurred to me, that he writes this work right after the fall of Constantinople. I mean, a few years after. But what's significant about that event, apart from everything we discussed, is that it was the end of the only overtly Catholic political regimes in what Aeneas would consider Europa. And that there's this moment in history when in Europe, at least, all political regimes are either overtly Catholic or subordinated to some other non-Christian empire, like the Ottomans or the Mongols, or like even Muscovy hasn't quite broken free yet, right? So it's a strange moment when he, as sort of a Catholic, a man of the church, cardinal at this point, is seeing a Europe that is politically all Catholic, right? Which was not going to last very long. Like,
Right.
First of all, you have Russia very soon afterwards, and the Reformation. Right.
Yeah.
So I see it as an interesting work that pops up in this little brief window.
Yes, it does, and it's a great point that I think one of the reasons this work becomes popular and continues to be popular. It's his opera are printed twice in the mid 16th century. There's a demand for his works, and Europe circulates quite a bit, as does a number of his other writings. But I think one of the reasons his concept of Europe is important is that yes, it's about Christianity, but there's a looseness to it that can be kind of co-opted, that can survive the break with Protestantism, and one could still sort of think loosely about Christianity, but above all, this idea of a European identity is very appealing because it gives people something to talk about without having to have a clear leader attached to it, right? You don't necessarily have to acknowledge the Pope to be talking about Europe, to see oneself as European, or any particular king or emperor, that there's a fluidity to it. So he does. I think another reason why it's an interesting work is that the way he describes these countries, just by telling these little stories about it, he arguably shrinks it. He arguably makes it knowable, and he tries to make these different countries, these foreign areas, seem not that exotic or bizarre, right? And some of the exoticism is deliberate and it's fun, but he still tries to bring them into this collective, right? To say that Europeans can be diverse, but yet all part of this whole.
Right. And this is one of the things that humanism can be good at, right? That ultimately you try to find the sort of common humanity, and to represent foreign cultures in a way that sort of makes sense. Though sometimes they are prone to exoticizing them and, all of that. And obviously they're not representing them in sort of necessarily faithfully. But I have found that to be an interesting part of this tradition, where at least you try to understand how these cultures work,
Right.
even if you get it wrong. I had seen something similar in Laonikos, who was writing roughly around the same time, I mean, just a few years later, who has all of these Herodotean ethnographies but Europe and Asia. And he's trying to do the same thing. And sometimes it's wacky, but
yeah,
he's not hostile.
right.
So I have a theory I wanted to run by you. Well, actually, not a theory, it's just sort of a set of observations. So what I've been writing is a survey of Western European views of the Eastern Empire. Long-term, as a survey from late antiquity to World War II. Focusing more on thought, less so on like art history. I'm not an art historian. After a certain point, the artistic exchanges get so dense, I can't follow them. But I'm thinking more of like historiographical models, ideas of not only identity but empire, research into the classics and things like that. And what I found was that before the period that you're describing, when there's this shift toward the term Europe in the West, that there's another term that's fairly common and used with sort of emotive force, which is the West. And not just Christendom or, the Christian Respublica or things like that, but the West, as in we Westerners. And I kept finding this.
How early do you see that?
Oh, in sort of medieval sources, I like. No, actually, let me rephrase that. It's a tradition that continues without a break from late antiquity, and originally, and I think for the duration of the Middle Ages, it refers to the distinction between the Western and the Eastern halves of the Roman Empire, and their respective churches. One of which operates in Latin, one operates in Greek. And so you see this East-West talk starting when there's the Roman Empire, and it has these two parts that kind of operate quasi-independently. And that discourse kicks in then. In other words, there's no center in this East-West. There's only East-West, and they're East and West in relation to each other only, not the rest of the world. It's an internal Greco-Latin convention, right? And what happens, this tradition continues in the early Middle Ages into the High Middle Ages. And when Western writers are they're thinking about the East, they will refer to their side collectively as the West. There's even a guy in the 12th century who wrote a history of the West. That's what he called it. And I don't know whether this was used in kind of emotive terms in this sense, but it clearly was a framework by which they designated these two halves of the Christian world. And I found it fascinating. Then I got thinking about the term the West, like even the way it's used today, like it's an oddly decentering term if you think about it, right? For a civilization that thinks that it is, I don't know, at the center of historical progress or whatever, it's calling itself the West. Like most civilizations don't call themselves in that kind of relational language. And so I realized this is actually a relic of a time when there were two halves to the Roman Empire, two sides of the original imperial church, the Greek and the Latin. And so the term the West makes sense only if you assume an Eastern empire.
Right, right.
Um, and I think this in part might have contributed to Aeneas's kind of destabilizing reaction to the fall of Constantinople. Like, wait, there's now no East.
Mhm.
And if you have a West without an East, what is it? And I think Europa might be what he came up with. Like, this is what we are now because there is no East.
Yeah, that's a good
Anyway,
point.
I'm
Mhm.
completely guessing about all of this.
Uh-huh.
I just made that up. I mean, the references are there in the texts. I'm just
Yeah.
not sure. Someone's got to map this tradition because I,
Yeah,
I, I
yeah.
haven't found it.
That's fascinating. That's really, I don't know that much about earlier uses of the West, and I'm curious to hear more about what you find and to see that traced because my sense is Aeneas is, definitely you can never say he's the first, but he starts using it in a charged way
Yeah.
after the fall of Constantinople, and he starts using it particularly, when he's still working for the emperor, writing to other rulers, right, trying to get them to join forces against the Ottomans. So he'll use terms like that, and some other writers will use terms like that. So I think you're right that that's coming from that sense. And one of the things that I've noticed is I think you're right that he's thrown off balance by this sense of, okay, what do we do with Greece now at this point? Because
Mm,
if Greece had been understood for a long time as the East or part of the East, is it now co-opted into the West, right? Does the dividing line shift a little bit? And is that line much more now between Europe and Asia than it had been before? Whereas, yeah, I mean, because when you think about the Roman Empire, I mean, like where does the East end for them? Like where does it begin, right? That it's,
right.
they certainly, I think we're put off by this notion of, okay, the Bosphorus, right? That's our marker.
Right.
You
Right.
know,
Right. Right.
so it's kind of interesting to see that I think he's trying to trying to create dividing lines in some ways, but you do sense in some of his writings that he's trying to figure out where to put the Greeks and how to explain the Greeks. And there's this fascinating moment in his letter to Mehmed II. He writes this letter to Mehmed II when he's Pope, and I've written about it. It's a very curious piece, and people have argued as to whether or not it was genuine. It is definitely him. It's his voice. There's no question about it. But whether he really wrote it as something he wanted to send, we know he never sent it, and it was never translated into Greek or Turkish or anything like that. But it definitely didn't make its way toward Mehmed. And the question is whether he even intended that. I've come up with different theories on that. My latest theory is that I think there's a little bit of both. That on some level he maybe thought it could be done, and it was an interesting idea. And then as he starts writing it, all of his old resentments come up and his old associations with the Ottomans, and he just can't shake them. Right? He's just incapable of really thinking about fully embracing this man without insulting him at the same time. And but there are passages where he's trying to explain the success of the Ottomans, and he gets some very interesting gendered language going at times, I think, and that creeps into the way he sees Europe and Asia, the way he sees East and West. And he, I think, tries to create this sense of a personality around the West and around Europe. And a big part of it is this sense of masculinity that these are the tough guys, and the Romans chose Christianity because it was hard, and and all the Western Europeans chose it because it's not an easy religion to follow. And then, of course, creates a lot of shares a lot of assumptions about Islam, right? A lot of falsifications about it and such. And but when he tries to talk about the Greeks, in this letter to Mehmed, whoever he's trying to persuade at this point, he has to try to explain how he conquered Christians, how he conquered Europeans. And he says, well, they're kind of the weaker ones, right? They're
Yeah.
and they were following the wrong faith, right? So they're not quite as mainstream as
Mm.
us Western Europeans. And it's fascinating, right? The way that sort of the mental gymnastics he goes
Yes.
through, trying to think about this concept of geography, this concept of culture. So, he does embrace the Greeks. He brings them in, but at times he kind of puts them lower on the food chain, right? And in ways that are, a little disturbing.
Well, you bring this up at the end of the book, and I wanted to talk about that. But first, I often try to picture Mehmed reading or reacting to some of these things that were sent to him, which
Right.
some of them are wild.
Mm-hmm.
This guy must have received the craziest kinds of, letters and treatises and ideas. And everybody's just trying to reinvent him in their image in some
Yes.
way. And wow, I'd give real money to see one of those reactions. But anyway, so at the end of the book, you do criticize Aeneas for his concept of Europe and some of these kinds of ways. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because you seem to suggest that he kind of left us with a sort of, it's an interesting idea what he's trying to do and, create this Europe in his humanist image, but it was a little bit of a poisoned legacy.
Mm.
So what are some of the main problems that you see with it?
Yeah. So good question. I think that um, you can understand where he was coming from, right? That given his concerns about the fall of Constantinople and certainly the Ottoman advance, as I say to my
Mm,
students, a lot has been made about the Ottoman Empire, sophisticated, cosmopolitan, all these things. But the Ottomans were not fluffy bunnies, right? The Ottomans were, they had expansion on their minds and they were looking to continue to move into areas uninvited, right? Or they took advantage of invitations that were sort of half-hearted and meant to be alliances. So you can appreciate that he was looking for ways to energize fellow Christians, fellow Europeans to create a common stand. And these things are rarely done in a nuanced and
mm,
nice fashion, right? We've seen that kind of language throughout history, how people are demonized, right, as to achieve that goal. So and I think he was right to be concerned about things like the Dev Shemeh, right, and about as part of the advance, the Ottomans they reach Otranto in 1480, right? They
yeah.
nearly succeed in taking Vienna twice, right? So I mean they were a threat to be reckoned with. But several contemporaries were more nuanced and I think better informed. And they were able to talk about the Ottomans as a political threat and as a concern without cutting them down to size, without having to resort to stereotypes of barbarism,
Yeah.
without ignoring some of their more important achievements. One of the things that struck me the more I read about Pius's views of Mehmed, I couldn't find a single place where it looked like he thought that the man could read. And I could be wrong about that, but he never comes out and it seems like he's incapable of seeing him as a scholarly, learned individual, which he was. I mean, it's no question about it. And other contemporaries talked about that, but he reverts to that stereotype of the barbarian in some ways.
Right.
And the closest he gets to giving him some praise is this strange letter to Mehmed that it's I think puts him more in the vein of a noble savage. So that's sort of classical trope. And so I think there's a lot of xenophobia that keeps cropping up. There are a lot of stereotypes. I think he creates an association of the Ottomans being backward,
Mm,
and that's one that I mean it sticks in a lot of ways. And I think that while there were other people, other contemporaries and other later writers who wrote much more nuanced depictions of the Ottomans, a lot of people read Aeneas. And his works just I think he was probably the most widely read humanist of his time.
right.
So he's very, very influential in that way. And so I describe him as, some people call him the father of Europe. I don't know if he's the father of Europe, but I would say he's the father of eurocentrism. That he really creates this
Mm,
notion of, this is what good culture looks like, and we have it, and I'm going to judge all other continents and parts of the world against it.
right.
Um, so I think there's that aspect. Also, the way he's writing about Europe is very defensive. And I think that gets embedded in a lot of these notions of Europe. There are many positive ways of thinking about Europe and thinking about European society, thinking about the European Union, right? Thinking about what Europe means today, what it has meant at different moments in time. But I think it's important to remember that he's writing at a time where he is juxtaposing it against this enemy. And I think that defensive language just keeps coming up again and again. And I think it's not too far off with some more xenophobic treatments that we see today, where people insist, that some people don't belong in Europe, right? That people shouldn't be allowed to immigrate there, that, problems with non-Christians and so forth. So that's one side of it. But to be fair, and just to give him credit for other things that he's done, he also created, in many ways, this embracing notion of Europe. I think he was very important in that he tried to get European nations and peoples to think about themselves as part of a larger collective that had something in common. And if you strip away some of that defensiveness, there's a lot of positivity there, right? There's certainly a sense of embracing the differences that people had and trying to look at their common interests, right? Their potential to work together. And he wasn't, a Pollyanna about it in the sense that he thought European nations were always going to get along because they're European or because they were Christian. He was well aware of the longstanding battles and such between them and rivalries. But he does, I think, offer a positive view that people can also take away from his works, that you can see that as having a long-term impact that's also useful, and as opposed to the one that's perhaps less useful.
Right. The nuance with which you describe this comes across in the book too, and I do hope that people read it, because this is a fascinating exploration of this. Well, one of the original moments when Europe becomes this kind of hot potato, question of, especially when it's not a political entity. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned the European Union because at least like which countries are in and which are not, though it's sort of expanding or contracting, depending. I mean, in my lifetime, I've seen it expand and now a little bit contract. So it's not like it's something set in stone, but at least you know who you're referring to. Whereas otherwise, without that kind of arrangement, it's never clear who's in and who's out. And there have been periods when other Europeans have wanted to exclude, for example, Spain, the Mongols of Europe, as one Frenchman put it. And especially in the East, it just becomes blurrier and blurrier until you don't know what. And then you start having all of these cultural or gender or whatever criteria, and it gets messy.
Yeah.
So I think that kind of dynamic comes across in his work and your analysis. So thank you for that. Yeah. And thank you also for coming on the podcast.
Oh, thank you. And thank you for your kind words about my book. I really appreciate that.
Oh, no, it's very well written. And I love this kind of the nuance of, for example, he talks so much about the Turks, but they can't decide, between their obvious strength and their barbarism and what does he do? And at the same time, with the Greeks, it's almost like the same kind of problem leads him mostly to silence. So you have this wonderful passage where you say, and I wasn't expecting you to say this, where you say, well, what did he think was going on in Christian Anatolia for all of these centuries? It's just a gap in his, he can't process it because it's not Europe, and it's, but it was Christian, it was part of this Eastern Empire, and it's just not there. Yeah. And this is one of the gaps that I want to drive a wedge into in some of my work. But anyway, Nancy, it was a real pleasure to speak with you, and we should do this again soon.
I would love that. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. And I, again, have really enjoyed your work and look forward to seeing, what you come out with about Constantinople and other things. So, it's been a pleasure, and, would love to do it again.
Likewise. Take care.
All right.